What if you had to travel 1,000 miles overland in the wilderness? What are you going to bring along to eat? I've been studying and thinking about people moving from the coast areas into the region of Tennessee and Kentucky in North America in the 18th century. That's 250 years ago. And the choices of food to bring along on the trail are very small and very particular. If you're going to be traveling on foot, whether today or 250 years ago, there are certain criteria, the kind of foods you need to bring along. They need to be something that is shelf stable and can live in a normal environment of 70 degrees all day long. Can't go bad. So it needs to work like that. It needs to be something very nutritionally dense. In other words, a lot of food value for being a fairly light food product. It needs to be something that's very easy to cook with very few implements. If possible, you should be able to eat it without cooking it at all. It should also be fairly inexpensive. It needs to be available and easy to transport. This set of criteria, well, it really narrows our choices, doesn't it? This applies whether we're backpacking today or if we're traveling through the Cumberland Gap and we're trying to settle Kentucky 250 years ago. So who were these people that were willing to endure 1,000 miles of foot travel with only the food you can carry on your back? The vast majority of people were living along the very east coast edge of North America. They weren't traveling more than 10 or 20 miles away from the ocean. But there was a certain breed of man and possibly family who was willing to undertake this very, very arduous travel. Early on, there were men who were going to explore or going to hunt. And some of these people were spying out the land, looking for places to settle. And later on in the 18th century, entire families and groups of families were going up into the backcountry to settle places like Kentucky. This was a very difficult place to travel. It was dangerous because of the environment, of the wild animals, and even sometimes the hostile Native American tribes that were in the area. So all these difficulties were there staring them in the face, as well as the need to bring your own food along with you. So what choices did they have in the time period for food? Let's start with meat and meat products. How about salt pork or salt beef? That's something we've talked about on the channel before. Unfortunately, that's really not a very viable solution for the people traveling by foot in the interior 250 years ago, because salt pork and salt beef are normally stored in large wooden kegs. Very difficult to transport over land unless you've got, say, a giant wagon or something. A lot of times that wasn't a choice. So we don't see these travelers using salt beef and salt pork. What they use instead of that is what Nicholas Creswell calls jerked beef or jerked bison. We would just call it dried and smoked. It's related to our modern jerky, except the modern jerky that we have today, we use that as a snack. We don't expect to have a meal out of jerky. And our jerky today tends to be heavily salted and heavily spiced. The jerked meat of the time period, the dried, smoked, say, bison or beef, or say maybe even venison, those items were not salted at all or salted very lightly, and rarely kind of smoked very lightly. They're mostly just dried. And if you think about traveling for, say, 3 weeks or 2 months, maybe you don't want exactly the same heavily spiced meat over and over. I can imagine that it's probably better for it to be a little plainer. It's easier to kind of mix it up then and add different flavors to it. Now, this kind of dried and smoked meat is actually the halfway point of making pemmican. If we take this same meat and we pulverize it and we mix it with the kidney fat of the animals, then we end up with pemmican. And pemmican is a wonderful, very, very dense food source. But it doesn't work well in very hot environments, and it's much more popular in the 19th century. Let's say with voyageurs in Canada and northern United States. In that time period, pemmican was really, really popular. But 250 years ago, probably not really known. Now here's one we probably don't think about much, and I doubt very many backpackers today are going to be carrying it, and that's bacon. So bacon in the time period is a little different than our bacon today. We definitely take our bacon, put it in the refrigerator, but their bacon was kept in the smokehouse. Or in the circumstance of traveling on foot, they would just wrap this up into, say, cloth or paper, something like that. This works great for a trekking situation. You're just going to slice off pieces of that and you're going to fry it up. It's going to definitely add all kinds of flavors to it. You might not have a bunch of this. It's probably used as a little bit of an addition. But somebody like Nicholas Creswell, who was traveling in the interior in 1774, 1775, he was carrying bacon. There are a couple other possibilities, not necessarily for the English culture that we're probably talking about here mostly, but for other cultures like Germans or people from other parts of Europe. Small cured sausages are probably very popular for traveling. And I don't see this much in a lot of the sort of people that we're thinking about that are going into the interior, but it's likely that German immigrants would use something like this. And the last one that pops up to my mind, it's probably doesn't fit the availability category, and that is dried fish. So stockfish was popular in the time period, but I doubt it was available to the people that were moving into the frontier situation. Now these frontiersmen, explorers, and settlers would likely have brought fish hooks along with them. Creswell talks about having fish hooks so that they could have fresh fish. Let's talk about our non-meat options. What about grains, vegetables, pulses? When I think about that immediately, I'm thinking bread. But bread generally is not a great traveling food. It tends to be bulky and it goes bad pretty quickly. But we've got other choices in the time period that they would use instead of that. And one of the very first ones, and ones that, today I wouldn't think about if I was backpacking, and that's certainly something like just straight flour. Flour is one of the things that they would say for soldiers, they would issue instead of bread. And flour is a product that you can get just about anywhere at any time. It's not the easiest thing to transport. They don't have plastic bags to carry it in or anything like that. And it does need to be kept dry, but it is fairly versatile. We can't really eat it right out of the bag. It's not great for that, but we can mix it with a little bit of water and we can make fire cakes with it. We can also use it for making dumplings or just mixing it in with a stew just to thicken up the watery part of it. So it is pretty versatile in that way, but it doesn't sound very tasty to me. Ship's biscuit would be another great choice for the overland traveler. We just make a very simple dough with the flour and the water and we bake it. And then we bake it again at very low temperature. We're just basically driving the water out of it. We're making it as dry as possible, but it's very dense and it's easy to transport. You do have to keep it dry, but even if it gets wet, it's still edible right away. We can eat it as it is. You can break it into little pieces and just put it in your mouth and let it melt. You don't want to crunch it up because it's hard on the teeth. And we can also mix it with other dishes, soups and stews. We can drop that in there and it gives a great tooth to it and really tastes good. A lot of people really enjoy the flavor of ship's biscuit, even though they're incredibly simple. There are also multiple corn products. In the 18th century, corn was very, very important to the North American economy. So a person traveling over land might be carrying corn that's in seed form, so just sort of dried corn. They might be carrying hominy, and there are two different kinds of hominy really in the time period. There's the hominy that we know today, that's basically the corn kernel that's soaked in lye, and then there's parched corn. So they didn't really call it parched in the time period that much, but they would call it hominy, where they bake the corn kernels until they sort of pop, and then you can have it just like that, or you can grind it up. And that's generally what they did. And this was something that was used by the Native Americans as well as the settlers and explorers and frontiersmen. This was a product that we could eat just as it is. Not very tasty, but it could easily be eaten that way and also mixed and used in several different kinds of dishes. There's also the possibility of bringing along just straight dried grains that we could use to cook, like dried peas or maybe oatmeal. Those are possibilities. You do have to cook them. They take a little bit of time, but they were certainly used by certain kinds of explorers and traders in North America. I don't know if you would want to walk with a whole lot of that as your main supply, but it is a possibility. As we continue to ponder these people that are traveling by foot mostly in this time period, they may have other things to help carry items for them. Maybe pack horses or something like that, but that's likely most people are using that or even less. They have to carry other things along with their food. They have to have a gun, they have to have a knife, they have to have a tomahawk. They probably got a little rope or a little canvas. And then they have to have items to cook with. The simplest items to cook with, something like a cooking kettle or maybe a little frying pan and a canteen with water. And that's it. That's all you've got to travel with. And none of these items are made out of the amazing lightweight materials that we have today. They're just using the simplest and most primitive technology possible to travel 1,000 miles. The more I read and study about the 18th century, and in particularly this sort of situation where people are going and settling the backcountry, the more I am amazed. People going with the most primitive equipment, the simplest foods, traveling for hundreds, if not 1,000 miles with only the things they can travel with on their back, and yet they have made possible so much of what we have today.